Snow had begun to fall again, slow and hushed, as though the heavens themselves wanted to bury the harshness of the world beneath a quilt of white. The prairie stretched out in silence, an endless sheet broken only by the lantern glow from one cabin crouched against the edge of the wilderness. Inside, the fire sighed and spat now and again, and Thomas Callahan sat by the table, his great hands resting on wood scarred by years of work. His boots were still dusted with frost from the day's labors, but he had not the energy to scrape them clean. Winter always pressed heavy on a man, but tonight it pressed heavier still, for he felt the weight of a loneliness he could neither name nor throw off. He had grown used to silence, used to the creak of the house and the low moan of wind around the rafters, but there was a hollowness to it that bit worse than the cold. It was near the hour when men give in to weariness, when the eyes blur in the lamplight, when suddenly there came a sound he had not heard in years. A knocking, soft, uncertain, yet desperate. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. He lifted his head, frowning. Few came to his cabin in winter, fewer still after dark. He stood, the chair groaning against the floor, and moved toward the door with the caution of one who has lived too long in a land where a man never knows what stands beyond the threshold. When he pulled open the heavy door, the snow whirled inward, sharp and biting. But sharper still was the sight that met him. A little girl, no more than 7 years of age, stood on the step. Her face, pale as moonlight, was streaked with tears that had half frozen on her skin. She wore a thin dress, hardly enough to ward off a mild autumn wind, let alone an early winter storm. Her dark hair clung damp against her cheeks, and in her eyes burned something stronger than fear, an urgent, pleading fire that stopped Thomas's breath. She raised her small hands, clenched tight together, as though praying he would not turn her away. "They are beating my mama," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush, not waiting for permission, not softened by courtesy. Her voice was raw with fright and ragged with cold. "For being Chinese. Please, sir. Please come." Thomas did not answer at once. The snow swirled between them, the child shaking, her small chest heaving. He could feel the echoes of his family's voices in his mind, John's harsh tone, Margaret's cold disdain. "This is not your fight. Don't bring trouble home." But the sight of the girl would not let him stand still. A grown man might be ignored, a wandering beggar cast aside, but not a child knocking on his door in winter with frost clinging to her lashes. "Where?" he asked at last, his voice low, steady. The girl pointed with a trembling hand toward the far edge of town, beyond the line of bare cottonwoods, where lanterns flickered in the distance. He could see the glow faint through the snow, firelight moving wrong, too bright for a simple hearth. Men gathering. The old sickness of cruelty. "Stay here," he told her. He bent, wrapped her in the thick coat that hung by the door, and without another word took his rifle down from its place above the hearth. The girl tried to clutch his hand, but he gently pried her fingers loose and stepped into the storm. The door shut behind him, the child swallowed by the glow of firelight within, and Thomas strode into the night with the snow stinging his beard. The walk was not long, but in winter's dark it stretched like a mile of judgment. As he neared the cottonwoods, voices reached him, cruel laughter cutting the wind. Through the trees he saw the shape of men, 5 or 6 of them, townsfolk he knew by sight, their faces blurred by the whirling snow. At their center, on the frozen ground, a woman knelt. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope, her hair black as a raven's wing, matted with ice. Her head was bent, and each time she tried to rise, one of the men shoved her down with a boot, jeering words Thomas could scarcely hear but knew well enough. Words spat at her for the shape of her eyes, the sound of her tongue, for the mere fact of her being. A foreigner, they called her. A curse on decent folk. They did not see her as a woman, only as other. Something cold and fierce took hold in Thomas's chest. He stepped from the trees. His voice, when it came, was calm as iron struck clean. "That's enough." The men turned, their laughter faltering. They saw the size of him first, broad-shouldered, near a head taller than most, the rifle steady in his grip. Then they saw the eyes, clear and unshaken, and their courage slipped. Still, one man, Elias Hardy, loud-mouthed and always eager for a crowd, spat into the snow and barked that Thomas should mind his own affairs. "This woman don't belong here," he sneered. "She's filth. We're giving her what's due." Thomas did not raise the rifle, but neither did he lower it. His voice, deep and unhurried, carried through the snow. She is under my roof. She is under my care. That makes her mine to protect. Step back. There was a moment where the storm seemed to hold its breath. The men glanced at one another, shifting. They were brave enough when facing a woman bound and beaten, but another thing entirely to face Thomas Callahan when the fire burned behind his eyes. Slowly, muttering curses, they stepped back, dragging Elias with them as he protested. The circle broke. Thomas moved forward, crouched, and with careful hands untied the rope. The woman's wrists were raw, her fingers trembling from cold and blood loss. She did not look at him at first, her hair falling like a curtain. Only when he whispered low, "You're safe now," did she lift her eyes. They were dark pools, weary, filled with pain, but beneath the pain flickered a light he had not expected. A quiet, unbroken dignity. He lifted her into his arms, her body light as frost, her breath shallow. She did not resist, did not speak, but her gaze lingered on him as if trying to measure what manner of man would dare stand against his own kin for her sake. Behind him the mob muttered, but none dared stop him as he carried her into the night. The snow deepened, covering their tracks, covering the shame of men who had raised their hands against the defenseless. When he reached his cabin again, the little girl rushed to the door, her cry piercing the storm, "Mama!" She reached for her mother's hand, clutched it, pressed her small face into it with a sob. Thomas carried them both inside, closing the door firmly behind. He laid the woman gently on the quilted bed, the fire's glow spreading over her bruises. Her breath came ragged, but steadier now. The girl held her tightly, refusing to let go. Thomas stoked the fire higher, set water to boil, and fetched the old tin of salve his mother once used for every wound life dealt. When he turned, he found the woman watching him through the haze of pain. Her lips parted as though she would speak, but no sound came. It was the girl who gave the name. "Mama's called Lianhua. My name is Mei Lin." Thomas inclined his head, as though they had entered into a quiet covenant. He did not smile, but something in his eyes softened. He knelt by the hearth, hands steady as he prepared to tend the wounds. The storm rattled the shutters, but inside, the world was narrowed to the firelight, the mother's labored breath, and the child's fierce grip. It struck him, as he worked, how quickly a man's life can turn. He had opened his door to silence, and now it held voices. He had expected another winter alone, and now two souls sat under his roof, fragile as sparrows yet fierce as any storm. He did not know what the days ahead would bring, only that the town would not forgive, that his kin would call this a betrayal. But as he brushed the dirt from Lianhua's bruised skin, he felt a resolve settle in him like stone. He had chosen, though no word of it had passed his lips. He had chosen at the knock of a child's hand on wood, chosen at the sight of cruelty in the snow, chosen now as he set his rifle by the bed and drew the quilt higher over the woman's shoulders. And outside, through the hiss of snow against the cabin walls, came the faint echo of distant voices, men who had not forgotten what he had done, and who would not leave it unanswered. The cabin had grown warmer by degrees, though the storm outside still hurled snow against the shutters with a steady fury. Within, the fire painted the walls in restless light, shadows moving like old ghosts across timber and stone. Thomas bent beside the bed, his large hands surprisingly careful as he bathed the bruises that darkened Lianhua's face and arms. He worked with a quiet rhythm, dipping the cloth into warm water, wringing it out with slow precision, as if reverence itself guided him. The air smelled of pine resin from the fire, sharp and sweet, mingling with a faint tang of blood and earth he cleaned from her wounds. Lianhua lay still, eyes half closed, her breath shallow but steadying under his care. From time to time her body flinched at the cool touch of water, but she did not pull away. Mei Lin remained pressed to her mother's side, small hand curled tightly around fingers that trembled with exhaustion. The child's eyes never left Thomas, watching as though weighing every movement, testing whether this man was truly safe or only another mask for cruelty. Thomas noticed, though he did not meet her gaze long. He was used to being regarded with caution, even by his own kin, for his size had always carried a shadow of menace. Yet tonight, under the scrutiny of a child's eyes, he felt a different weight altogether. He dipped the cloth again, brushed it gently across the cracked skin at Lianhua's temple, and murmured something low, not words meant to be heard, but the kind of sound a man makes to steady his own hands. When at last the worst of the dirt was washed away, he spread the salve across her wrists where the rope had cut. The scent of herbs rose, bitter and familiar, a memory of his mother's quiet care long ago. He bound her wrists with strips of soft linen, torn from the old trunk where his family's past lay folded and forgotten. Each knot he tied with the same firmness he used when setting a saddle, though his fingers lingered longer, ensuring the wrap pressed neither too tight nor too loose. Lianhua's eyes fluttered open, dark and glistening, and for a moment they met his. He saw in them not gratitude exactly, but something quieter, an acknowledgment that she was seen. She parted her lips as though to speak, but the effort broke into a cough. Mei Lin stroked her arm quickly, whispering in a language Thomas did not understand, words smooth and flowing like water. The mother's breathing calmed, though her eyes closed again with fatigue. Thomas rose to his feet, setting the basin aside, and turned to the hearth. He stirred the pot that hung above the fire. Simple broth, nothing more, but hot and filling. He ladled some into a tin cup and brought it to the bed, kneeling again. Lianhua stirred, her lips parting slightly. Thomas lifted her gently, steadying her head with a large palm, and tipped the cup so the warm liquid touched her mouth. She drank in small sips, the line of her throat trembling, and after a few swallows turned her head away. That was enough. He set the cup down, eased her back against the pillow, and for the first time allowed himself to breathe more fully. He had done what he could for now. Her healing would take time, perhaps more than the winter would allow, but she was alive, and that was more than those men had intended. When he looked again at Mei Lin, he saw the child's shoulders relax, just barely. Her eyes softened, though her hand remained firmly clasped in her mother's. She whispered thank you, the words rough with the effort of a language not her own. Thomas inclined his head, accepting it without reply. Words felt clumsy, unnecessary in that moment. He turned back to the hearth, crouched low, and added another log to the fire. Sparks leapt upward, catching the dimness with brief flashes. He sat on the floorboards a while, elbows braced on his knees, watching the flames dance. His thoughts were heavy. He knew what tomorrow would bring. Word of what he had done would already be spreading through town. Men would call him a fool, women would whisper he had disgraced his blood. And his own kin, John with his sharp tongue, and Margaret with her cold eyes, would not forgive him for placing an outsider under their roof, let alone a Chinese woman. Yet as he glanced back at the bed, at the woman breathing softly beneath the quilt, at the child who clung to her hand as though anchoring her to this world, Thomas felt the certainty settle deeper. Let them talk. Let them scorn. He had lived long enough in the shadow of others' judgment, and it had never filled the emptiness within him. Tonight, in the silence of his cabin, with two strangers under his roof, he felt, for the first time in years, that his choices mattered. The hours passed in quiet. He dozed lightly in the chair, waking at every sigh or shift from the bed. At dawn, the storm had eased. The snow lay thick and unbroken across the prairie, the world hushed and clean. Thomas stepped outside, breath clouding in the brittle air, and gathered wood from the shed. Each creak of the boards, each crunch of his boots in the snow, carried a strange clarity. He knew eyes would soon turn this way, that trouble would find his door again. When he returned, the cabin smelled of warmth and broth, though the silence of the two figures in his bed remained heavy. He set the wood by the hearth, stoked the fire, and busied himself with chores as though the rhythm of his day had not been altered. Yet every movement he made was marked by the awareness that his cabin was no longer empty. By mid-morning, the sound of horses' hooves broke the quiet. Thomas straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers, and moved to the window. He saw two riders approaching through the snow, his brother John at the front, shoulders hunched, jaw tight, and behind him Margaret, her posture stiff and proud even in the saddle. Trouble had arrived on time, as he knew it would. He opened the door before they could knock, standing tall in the frame. John reined in hard, glaring up at him. Heard you brought trouble home, brother. Heard you dragged it right through town and into your bed. Margaret's eyes flicked past him toward the dim interior, though she said nothing yet. Thomas's voice was steady. I did what was right. John spat into the snow. What's right is keeping to our own. You think folks'll forgive this? You think Pa's name won't be dragged through mud because you can't mind your place? Margaret's voice was cooler, sharper. Thomas, whatever kindness you think you're doing, it will cost you everything. Land. Inheritance. Respect. Are you willing to throw it away for a stranger who doesn't belong here? Inside the cabin, Mei Lin had drawn closer to her mother, both listening, both tense. Thomas felt their presence like a weight between his shoulders. He did not look back, but his voice carried into the room all the same. She belongs here now. John cursed, swinging down from his horse, his boots crunching against the snow. You've gone soft. Foolish. You'll drag us all into ruin. Thomas stepped forward, filling the doorway with his height. If ruin comes, it comes to me, not to you. The two siblings stared at him, faces hardened against the cold. For a long moment, only the wind moved between them. Then Margaret's lips thinned, her eyes narrowing with something like sorrow, though it was wrapped in pride too thick to bend. Very well. You've chosen your path. Do not expect us to walk it with you. She turned her horse, John mounting with a mutter of curses, and together they rode back toward town. The snow closed behind them, the silence heavy once more. Thomas shut the door and leaned against it for a moment, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what had passed. He knew the cost had only just begun. When he turned, he found Lianhua watching him, eyes clearer than before though still marked with pain. She had seen enough to understand, perhaps, that he had chosen her fate alongside his own. Her lips parted, voice faint but certain. Why? Thomas paused, meeting her gaze. His answer came not as explanation, but as truth simple and steady. Because no one should stand alone in the snow. The fire crackled between them, and in the silence that followed, something shifted. Not trust yet, not safety entire, but the beginning of both. Outside, the sky hung heavy with gray, promising more storms. And from the far distance came the faint echo of voices, townsfolk carrying the tale, weaving it sharper with every retelling, shaping a threat that would soon return to his cabin with greater force than kin alone. Snow lay deeper with each passing day, drifting against fences and swallowing the trails until the prairie seemed to stretch into a white eternity. The cabin stood like a dark heart against it, smoke curling from the chimney in thin, fragile strands that dissolved into gray skies. Within, the fire kept its steady vigil, warming three lives that had begun to bind themselves together in quiet, almost unseen ways. Thomas had grown accustomed to the sound of two softer breaths beneath his roof. Mei Lin's quick, high voice filled spaces once hollow with silence, and Lianhua's measured, careful words carried into the stillness like the faint chime of glass. Each day Thomas brought wood, water, or food from the sheds and outbuildings, and each day he found her hands had moved to mend or clean, small gestures that built a sense of belonging without a single declaration. At first, she remained wary, her gaze lowered, her steps light as if she might vanish at any moment. But slowly, in the rhythm of days wrapped in snow, she began to meet his eyes when he spoke. Once he returned from the barn to find her at the table, mending his torn work shirt with even stitches, her head bowed but her hands steady. She had not asked permission, yet the sight stirred something within him, an ache that felt both new and ancient. He said nothing, only placed a block of fresh wood by the hearth, but when he turned, he caught the faintest curve of her lips. Not a smile, not yet, but the shadow of one. Mei Lin, too, shifted. The first nights she clung fiercely to her mother, unwilling to move from her side. But now she sometimes drifted closer to Thomas, especially when he read aloud from the tattered book of psalms and poems his mother had once held dear. His deep voice carried in the glow of lamplight, and though the words were not stories she understood fully, she listened with wide eyes, as though the rhythm itself gave her rest. One evening, while the snow hissed against the windows, she leaned her head against his knee as he read, and though she said nothing, the act struck Thomas more deeply than any spoken trust. Yet peace did not hold beyond the cabin walls. Each trip into town carried the weight of eyes and whispers. Men at the trading post shifted aside with mocking laughter, their words loud enough for him to hear. China filth under your roof, Callahan? Shame on your name. Women turned their faces, whispering into one another's ears with looks of pity and scorn. His kin, when they passed him, gave no greeting. John's stare held venom, and Margaret's silence was sharper than insult. Thomas bore it with the same steadiness he carried into storms, but he felt the tension coiling tighter with each day. He did not tell Lianhua of the worst he heard, though she seemed to know. There were moments she glanced toward the door as though expecting it to burst open with accusation. Her hands trembled once while kneading bread, and when he asked if she was cold, she shook her head. It was not cold that made her tremble but memory, the memory of boots, fists, and voices calling her less than human. Still, there were moments of fragile grace. On a morning when the sky cleared pale blue and the snow glittered like shards of glass, Thomas returned from chopping wood to find Mei Lin outside the cabin, bundled in a too-large coat. She was laughing as she tried to build a crooked snowman, her small hands red from cold. Lianhua stood nearby, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders, her dark hair catching the light. She looked up as Thomas approached, and their eyes met across the brightness of snow. For a moment, it seemed the world's judgment fell away. For a moment, it was only a man watching the woman who had begun to claim space in his silence, and a child who had already claimed his heart without asking. But the storm gathering in town could not be held at bay by laughter or firelight. Word spread faster than snowmelt. At the tavern, men muttered that Thomas Callahan had turned traitor to his kind, letting a foreigner darken his father's legacy. Some spat that she must have bewitched him, others that he had lost his wits. Threats grew bolder. Once, when Thomas left the smithy, he found a mark carved into the snow near his horse's hooves, a crude cross slashed through with a line, a warning as clear as words. It was Margaret who came first to warn him. She stood at the cabin threshold one evening, cloaked against the wind, her face pale in the firelight. She did not step inside. Her voice was clipped, almost pleading beneath the pride. "Thomas, they mean to drive her out. If you keep her here, they will not stop at words. You will lose everything." Thomas met her eyes, steady as ever. "I cannot turn them out into the snow." Margaret's lips pressed thin. She glanced past him to the dim shape of Lianhua seated by the fire, Mei Lin curled in her lap. A flicker of something crossed her face, pity, perhaps, or envy, but she masked it quickly. "Then may God help you," she whispered, "because no one else will." She turned and was gone, her figure swallowed by snow. Thomas shut the door and stood in the silence, feeling the weight of her words settle like frost across his chest. Inside, Lianhua's gaze lingered on him. She rose slowly, moved to the table, and with hands still faintly trembling, set down a bowl of broth before him. Her voice was quiet, halting, as though each word carried weight. "You lose much because of us." Thomas looked at her, the firelight etching lines of strength and weariness across his face. He shook his head. "I lost much long before you came." She held his gaze for a long moment, then lowered her eyes. Yet when she turned away, he saw her shoulders straighten, as though a burden had lightened just enough to let her breathe. Winter thickened. Nights lengthened. And with them, Thomas felt the tension grow like a second storm outside the walls. Men no longer only whispered, they planned. He saw them gathered in shadows near the mercantile, their voices hushed but their glances sharp. He knew the day would come when they would no longer be content with scorn. One night, as he mended tack by the fire, Mei Lin curled up with her small hands wrapped around his arm. "Uncle," she whispered, the word shy, testing. His chest tightened at the sound. He set aside the leather strap, looking down at her wide, dark eyes. She repeated it, firmer this time, as if to seal it into truth. "Uncle." Then she smiled, a true, bright smile that reached through the dimness of the room and broke something open inside him. Lianhua watched from the other side of the hearth. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of sorrow and tenderness, but her eyes lingered on Thomas longer than they had before. She did not stop her daughter from speaking the word. She only smoothed Mei Lin's hair and whispered something soft in her own tongue, a word Thomas did not know but understood in its warmth. The days that followed carried the rhythm of waiting. Waiting for the storm outside to break, waiting for the knock or the shout at the door. Each evening Thomas checked the rifle, laid wood by the hearth, and sat near the door as though prepared. Each morning Lianhua rose to cook, her hands stronger now, her voice returning in low hums of song that filled the cabin with a fragile hope. The cabin had become a home, though the world outside sharpened its knives. Then came the day when hoofbeats thundered nearer than before. Thomas looked up from the barn to see a group of men ride past the ridge, their faces hard, their voices carrying rough laughter. They slowed as they saw him, and one spat into the snow before kicking his horse onward. It was not yet a confrontation, but it was a warning written clear across the frozen land. That night, the fire burned brighter, but the warmth could not chase the weight from the air. Lianhua sat by the window, staring out into the dark, her face caught between fear and resolve. Thomas moved to stand beside her, the silence between them heavy. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady though soft. "If we leave, maybe peace comes back to you." Thomas's jaw tightened. His gaze stayed fixed on the storm outside, but his words were for her alone. Peace means nothing if it is bought with cowardice. She turned to him, her eyes wide, searching. In their dark depths he saw the reflection of the fire, and something else, something growing between them, unspoken but alive. The storm rattled the cabin walls as if echoing his words, as if reminding them both that choices carry costs. And beyond that storm, in the heart of town, voices were gathering, torches being readied, anger fed like kindling on a growing fire that would soon blaze its way to his door. The storm broke at dusk, not from the sky but from the earth, carried on the sound of boots crunching frozen ground and the sharp hiss of men's voices carried through the dark. The prairie wind had stilled, yet the air seemed alive, holding its breath as torches flared against the snow. From the cabin window Thomas saw their approach, lanterns swinging, shadows stretching long across the drifts, a mob of faces hardened by scorn and fueled by the bitter heat of prejudice. The glow of firelight stained the snow crimson, and for a moment it seemed as though the whole horizon had caught flame. Inside, the air thickened with fear. Lianhua sat rigid by the hearth, Mei Lin clutching tightly to her sleeve, eyes wide and fixed on the door. The child's trembling had returned, though this time she did not cry. She only pressed herself closer to her mother, her small body strung with terror like a bow pulled taut. Lianhua's face was pale but steady, though her breath came shallow, her hands clenching and unclenching as if ready to shield her daughter with nothing but her own flesh. Thomas stood by the table, shoulders straight, jaw carved in stone. He had expected this night. He had waited for it, felt it gather with each whisper and glance in town, each warning carried on kin's voices. Now it had arrived, torches at his door, men who would not be turned back by silence. He crossed to the rifle leaning against the wall, his hand wrapping around the stock with calm inevitability. Yet even as he lifted it, his eyes softened when they met the faces by the fire. "Stay here," he said, his voice low but firm, a promise more than a command. The child's eyes shone in the dim glow, and Lianhua's lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. Something in his face silenced her, something that carried the weight of both defiance and surrender, the look of a man who had chosen his stand long before the enemy arrived. The pounding on the door came hard and sudden, rattling the frame. Voices followed, sharp with hatred, slashing through the quiet like whips. "Callahan, bring her out. Bring the filth into the snow, and we'll be done." Thomas moved to the door and unbarred it slowly. The wood groaned as he pulled it open, letting in the bite of winter air and the blaze of torchlight. The mob stood gathered, faces lit with fire, eyes glittering with malice. John Callahan stood near the front, jaw tight, eyes flashing with the satisfaction of a man who believes his moment has come. Thomas stepped into the threshold, filling the space, the rifle steady across his chest. His voice cut through the tumult with calm iron. "You'll not lay a hand on her." A murmur swept the crowd, some jeering, others shifting uneasily. John stepped forward, his breath misting in the frigid air. "You've gone against your blood, against your name. You think you can shame us all by keeping her here? That woman doesn't belong, and you'll lose everything clinging to her." Thomas's eyes did not waver. "Then I lose everything." The words struck like stone thrown into still water, rippling through the men, silencing laughter. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of torches. Then Elias Hardy, his voice loud and venomous, snarled, "If you won't give her up, we'll take her." He stepped forward, torch raised, and the mob surged behind him. Thomas lifted the rifle, his face unreadable. The crowd slowed, halted by the certainty in his stance. He did not point the weapon skyward as a warning. He aimed it level, his finger brushing the trigger with the steady patience of a man who knew his ground and would not yield it. "Step back," Thomas said, his voice carrying through snow and fire. For a long breath, no one moved. Torches hissed as snowflakes fell against their flames. The men wavered, courage fraying under the weight of his stillness. Yet John, bitter and proud, pushed forward, spitting words meant to cut. "You'll burn with her, Thomas. You'll see your land ruined, your name spat on. All for a whore who—" The word had not finished leaving his mouth before Thomas struck. He swung the rifle but hard and fast, the blow catching John across the jaw, sending him sprawling into the snow. A hush fell. The firelight danced on wide eyes, on mouths half open with shock. No one had expected it, the sudden burst of violence, the proof that Thomas Callahan would not only speak his stand but enforce it with his strength. John lay groaning, blood darkening the snow, his torch sputtering beside him. Thomas did not move to finish the fight. He only stood tall above him, rifle back in his grip, gaze sweeping the crowd. Who else? The silence grew heavier, broken only by the crackle of torches and John's ragged breath. One by one, men shifted back, their bravado crumbling. They had come for an easy conquest, a show of power against a bound woman. They had not come for this, for the immovable defiance of a man standing in firelight, willing to face them all alone. At last Elias cursed, spat into the snow, and turned his horse. The others followed, muttering, their torches flickering away into the dark. Only John remained, sprawled and humiliated, before he too staggered to his feet, his eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed, before stumbling after the others. Thomas stood in the doorway long after the last glow had vanished, snow settling once more into silence. His chest rose and fell, his hand steady though the storm of blood still surged in his veins. Then slowly he turned back inside, closing the door against the night. Lianhua and Mei Lin stared at him from the firelight, their faces pale but their eyes shining with something fierce, relief, awe, perhaps even trust. Mei Lin broke first, rushing forward to wrap her small arms around his waist, pressing her face against him. Thomas froze, then rested his free hand lightly on her head. His eyes lifted to Lianhua. She had risen, standing in the glow, her quilt slipping from her shoulders. Her gaze held his, dark and steady, no longer lowered in fear or shame. Slowly, she stepped closer, her voice soft but carrying the weight of decision. "You risked everything. For us." Thomas's reply was low, almost a whisper. "I risked nothing worth keeping." Something broke in her then, not weakness but the wall she had built around her heart. She reached for him, her fingers trembling as they touched the rough sleeve of his coat. Her hand lingered there, and in her eyes burned a light that no storm, no mob, no kin could quench. He set the rifle aside, his shoulders easing for the first time. Kneeling before her, he took her hand in his, larger and calloused, yet holding hers as if it were fragile glass. He lifted his gaze to meet hers fully. "You are free. But if you choose, stay. As my wife." The fire crackled between them, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to pause. Then her lips parted, a tremor passing through her, and she whispered yes. The word was so faint it might have been mistaken for the sigh of the fire, but it was enough. Mei Lin pressed herself between them, her small hands clasping both of theirs together, binding them in a circle of warmth and trembling joy. The three knelt in the firelight, shadows long against the walls, a family not born of blood or town's approval but of choice, defiance, and a knock on a winter night. Outside, the prairie lay silent, the snow unbroken once more. But within, the cabin glowed brighter than it ever had, the firelight carrying across their faces, weaving them together in a bond that no storm could scatter. And yet, beyond the silence, beyond the stillness, the town smoldered with anger, kin with betrayal. The battle had been turned tonight, but the war of hearts was not yet finished. For in choosing love against hatred, Thomas Callahan had set himself against blood and name, and the reckoning would not end with firelight alone.